It was 3 a.m. The house was completely silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the soft breathing of my children sleeping down the hall. My hands were shaking, not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from the strange, overwhelming realization that everything was finally over. 8 months ago, my husband tried to destroy my entire life. Not just our marriage, everything. My career, my reputation, my relationship with our children, the company I spent over a decade building from nothing, and he almost succeeded. If I hadn't discovered the truth when I did, I would probably be sitting in a courtroom right now, watching strangers decide whether I was allowed to see my own children. But my husband made one critical mistake. He forgot who he married. My name is Julia Mitchell. I'm 42 years old, and I run a corporate security consulting firm in Chicago. Before that, I spent 12 years in Army intelligence. My entire professional life has revolved around one skill: understanding how people plan betrayals before they happen. Corporations hire me to uncover internal threats. Executives trust me to detect sabotage before it destroys their companies. I study patterns, motives, weaknesses. I think like the enemy. What my husband never realized was that while he and his partner were quietly planning how to ruin me, they were unknowingly playing a game against someone who had spent her entire adult life learning how to dismantle operations exactly like theirs. By the time I discovered their plan, they had already spent months preparing it. A carefully constructed strategy designed to destroy my business, bankrupt me through lawsuits, take my children away, and leave me with nothing. But once I understood what they were doing, the situation changed. Because if there's one rule I learned in military intelligence, it's this: never interrupt your enemy while they're making a mistake. So instead of confronting them, I started watching, listening, collecting evidence, and slowly, methodically, building a case that would not only save my life, but completely destroy the people who thought they could manipulate me. Tonight, the final domino finally fell. My husband lost everything: his reputation, his allies, his family's power, even the woman he betrayed me for. But the most important thing, my children are asleep safely down the hall. And for the first time in months, our home finally feels peaceful again. To understand how everything collapsed the way it did, you have to start 8 years ago, the night I met the man who would eventually try to ruin me, and the moment I made the biggest mistake of my life. 8 years ago, I met Daniel Morgan at a charity fundraiser for Children's Memorial Hospital in downtown Chicago. At the time, my life was finally starting to stabilize. I had left the Army 2 years earlier after 12 intense years in military intelligence, and I had just launched my company, Mitchell Security Consulting. It wasn't glamorous back then. My office was a small rented workspace with one assistant, a used laptop, and about $50,000 in savings that represented nearly everything I owned. Most days I was working 16-hour shifts, trying to convince companies that a former intelligence officer could help them protect their data and executives from threats. Some months were good. Other months were terrifying. That fundraiser almost didn't happen for me. I had been debating whether I should even attend. Networking events felt awkward after the military, and at the time my company was still too small to impress anyone. But that night changed everything. Daniel Morgan walked into the ballroom about 30 minutes after the event began. He had the kind of presence that made people notice immediately. Tall, perfectly tailored navy suit, confident smile. Dark hair brushed neatly back like he had stepped out of a magazine advertisement. Women turned their heads. Men shook his hand with visible respect. But what truly made Daniel stand out wasn't just his appearance. It was his last name. Daniel Morgan came from one of the most powerful families in Illinois. His father, David Morgan, was a sitting United States senator. His mother, Helen Morgan, was a federal judge. He had grown up in a $3 million home in Lincoln Park, attended private schools his entire life, and moved effortlessly through social circles filled with politicians, investors, and wealthy donors. Compared to that world, I felt like an outsider. A former soldier with a startup security firm, and a habit of scanning every room for potential threats. But somehow, Daniel seemed fascinated by that. Our first conversation lasted almost 40 minutes. "You were Army intelligence?" he asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "Yeah," I said, "mostly counterintelligence and threat analysis." "That sounds incredibly dangerous." "It's mostly paperwork," I joked. He laughed. Not the polite kind of laugh people give at networking events. A real one. By the end of the evening, he asked me out to dinner. Our first date happened 2 nights later at one of the most expensive restaurants in Chicago. The bill came to almost $300. Daniel ordered the most expensive wine on the menu without even glancing at the price. At the time, I remember thinking it was extravagant, but I also remember how natural he seemed in that environment. Like luxury was simply the normal backdrop of his life. The relationship moved quickly. 6 months later, he was spending most nights at my apartment. 1 year after that, I proposed. I still remember the nervous feeling in my chest as I slid the ring across the table. A 3-carat diamond that had cost me $18,000, nearly 2 months of my income at the time. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. Then he smiled. "Are you serious?" he asked softly. "I am." He slipped the ring on his finger and laughed. "Well," he said, squeezing my hand, "I guess I'm the luckiest man in Chicago." Our wedding happened the following summer. It was everything Daniel wanted. 200 guests, 7-course dinner, open bar. The final bill came to $85,000. But at the time, my company was finally growing. I had just landed 2 major corporate security contracts, and I wanted the day to feel special. For the first few years, life felt almost perfect. Mitchell Security expanded faster than I expected. By 2016, we had 12 employees and several large corporate clients. Daniel's career in luxury real estate development was also thriving. We bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in Lincoln Park for $1.2 million. 2 BMWs sat in the driveway. We took European vacations twice a year. But the biggest moment came on March 15th, 2016. At 3:22 a.m., our son Tyler was born. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He screamed so loudly that nurses in the next hallway started laughing. 12 minutes later, our daughter Emma arrived. 6 pounds, 11 ounces. Quiet. Almost too quiet. For a moment, the doctors were worried something might be wrong, but she was perfectly healthy. 2 beautiful children, 2 perfect little lives. And from that moment on, everything I did became about protecting their future. What I didn't realize at the time was that something dark had already started growing. And it was already far too late. My company kept growing faster than I had ever expected. New contracts came in, one after another. Technology firms worried about data breaches, financial companies concerned about executive safety, private corporations hiring us to audit internal security. By we had a staff of 12. Annual revenue had climbed past $2 million. But success comes with a cost. And in my case, that cost was time. Most weeks I was working 60 to 70 hours. Late nights reviewing reports, emergency trips to clients who discovered internal leaks or cyber threats. At the time, I believed I was doing the right thing. Every contract meant more security for my family, better schools for Tyler and Emma, a safer future. Daniel always said he understood, at least in the beginning. Some nights he would walk into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee and gently place one beside my laptop. "You've been staring at that screen for 3 hours, he would say, rubbing my shoulders. "You're going to burn yourself out." "I'm fine," I'd reply. "You always say that." He'd kiss the top of my head and whisper, "Just remember, we miss you out there." Back then, those words felt loving. Now, looking back, I realized they were the first cracks. Because sometime around late 2018, Daniel began to change. It started with small things. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Text messages he would quickly swipe away before I could see the screen. He began attending social events without me. Charity dinners, industry parties, networking galas. One evening, I asked him directly, "Why didn't you invite me tonight?" He shrugged casually while adjusting his jacket. "You're always busy with work anyway. I figured you wouldn't want to go." The answer sounded reasonable, but something about the way he avoided eye contact left an uncomfortable feeling in my chest. A few weeks later, Rachel Parker entered our lives. Daniel introduced her one Saturday morning over breakfast. She's a business partner, he explained. Rachel was 35, recently divorced, no children. She drove a black BMW M5, wore tailored suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and had a kind of effortless charisma that filled every room she entered. Within 10 minutes of meeting her, I understood why Daniel admired her. She was smart, confident, ambitious, the kind of person who could walk into a crowded room and immediately control the conversation. They're planning a big commercial development downtown, Daniel told me excitedly. Rachel has connections with investors we've never worked with before. Rachel smiled warmly. I've heard a lot about you, Julia, she said. Daniel says you're basically a genius when it comes to security. I laughed politely. Genius might be pushing it. Over the following months, Rachel became a regular presence in our lives. She came over for dinner. She brought toys for the kids, expensive bottles of wine for Daniel and me. Sometimes we would sit in the living room long after dinner while Tyler and Emma slept upstairs. Rachel and I would talk about business strategy. Daniel would listen with interest. You two think exactly the same way, he once said with a laugh. At the time, I took it as a compliment. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was, because every conversation we had, every casual discussion about my work, was quietly giving Rachel information she shouldn't have had. She asked detailed questions about my clients, about the types of threats corporations worried about surveillance equipment my company used, about the kinds of cases that paid the most. I assumed she was simply curious, maybe even impressed. But what I didn't understand then was something every intelligence officer eventually learns. People rarely ask detailed questions without a reason. By early 2019, Daniel's attitude toward me had shifted completely. Everything I did seemed to irritate him. How I loaded the dishwasher, how late I worked, even the way I disciplined the children. One night during an argument, he said something that still echoes in my mind. The kids need their mother present, Julia. Money isn't everything. The words hit me harder than he probably intended, because the irony was impossible to ignore. Everything I was doing, every long hour, every exhausting business trip, was specifically so our family could maintain the life he loved. The designer clothes, the luxury vacations, the private school tuition. But despite criticizing my schedule, Daniel never once suggested we cut our spending. The expensive lifestyle remained exactly the same. And Rachel, she was suddenly everywhere. Saturday mornings with coffee and bagels, soccer games with Tyler, Emma's dance recitals. She even helped tuck the kids into bed sometimes when she stayed late after dinner. And I, like a complete fool, welcomed her into our home, into our family, into our trust. I thought I had gained a friend. What I didn't realize was that I had unknowingly invited the person who was helping my husband plan the destruction of my entire life. And the moment that finally made me realize something was terribly wrong came in February of 2020. The night I returned home from a business trip and discovered that my own children were starting to look at me like a stranger. The moment everything truly began to unravel happened on a cold evening in February 2020. I had just returned from a week-long emergency contract in Seattle. A large tech company had suffered a major internal data breach. Their board hired my firm to contain the damage and identify the source before the story reached the media. It was the kind of crisis situation that required absolute focus. 7 days. Almost no sleep, but the client paid $75,000 for the week of work. And by the time my flight landed back in Chicago, I felt both exhausted and relieved. All I wanted was to go home, see my kids, eat something that didn't come from an airport lounge. The February wind cut sharply through the parking lot as I stepped out of the car and walked toward our house. Normally, when I opened the front door after a trip, the house exploded with noise. "Mom's home!" Tyler would sprint down the hallway like a rocket. Emma would follow right behind him, usually holding some drawing she wanted to show me. But that night, the house felt strangely quiet. The living room lights were on. Music drifted faintly from the kitchen, and when I stepped inside, I immediately noticed something strange. There were people everywhere. Strangers. A group of Daniel's real estate colleagues stood around the kitchen island drinking wine. Someone I didn't recognize was sitting on our couch scrolling through their phone. It looked less like a home and more like a networking event. Daniel barely looked up when I walked in. He was sitting at the kitchen counter with his laptop open, speaking to someone about property financing. "Oh," he said casually when he noticed me. "You're back." Just 2 words. No hug. No smile. No excitement. It felt like I had just walked into a hotel lobby instead of my own house. "Hi," I said quietly. He nodded and turned back to his conversation. The coldness caught me completely off guard. I set my bag down and glanced around the room, searching for Tyler and Emma. They were sitting together on the far end of the living room couch. Usually when I returned from a trip, they would run straight into my arms. But tonight, they looked hesitant, almost shy. "Hey, you two," I said softly, kneeling down in front of them. "Did you miss me?" Tyler nodded slowly. Emma leaned forward and hugged me, but something about it felt different, like she wasn't sure if she was supposed to. That subtle hesitation sent a tight knot into my chest. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. Neither of them answered. A few minutes later, after the guests had left and the house finally quieted down, I found Daniel in the kitchen closing his laptop. "Can we talk?" I asked. He sighed, like the request itself was inconvenient. "What about?" "I just got home after being gone a week," I said carefully, "and the kids barely reacted. What's going on?" Daniel leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. "You really want to know?" "Yes." He looked at me with an expression that felt strangely distant. "They're just not used to you being around anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What does that mean?" "It means you're always working," he said flatly. "Traveling, late nights, phone calls, meetings." "I'm running a company, Daniel." "And in the process," he replied coldly, "you've become a stranger in your own home." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The accusation felt deeply unfair. Everything I had built, the house, the lifestyle, the stability, was because of those long hours. "Do you think I enjoy being gone?" I asked quietly. Daniel shrugged. "All I know is the kids are starting to notice." That night, we went to bed without resolving anything. Daniel fell asleep quickly, turning his back toward me. But I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed every moment of the evening. The awkward hug from Emma, Tyler's hesitation, Daniel's cold words. Something about the situation felt wrong. Not just emotionally wrong. Logically wrong. In intelligence work, instincts are everything. You learn to recognize subtle behavioral shifts. Tiny signals that something beneath the surface isn't matching the story being presented. And Daniel's explanation didn't fully add up. Yes, I worked long hours, but our children had never treated me like a stranger before. Something else was influencing them. Something I didn't understand yet. At 2:17 a.m., I quietly slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The kitchen was dark, except for the soft glow of the laptop screen Daniel had forgotten to close. His MacBook Pro sat open on the counter. In the Army, we had a rule about investigations. Never jump to conclusions. First, you gather information. Then you analyze patterns. Then you build a complete picture before taking action. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with Daniel anymore. I wasn't going to guess. I was going to find out the truth. The investigation started the next morning. Daniel had a predictable routine. He left the house around 7:30 a.m. to take the kids to school. Then he went straight to his office. That gave me roughly 10 minutes each morning before I needed to leave for work. 10 minutes with his laptop. Most people don't understand something very important about deleted digital files. When you delete something, it's not actually gone. The computer simply marks that space as available for new data. Until something overwrites it, the original information remains exactly where it was. Daniel had cleared his browser history. He had emptied the trash folder. But he didn't know about shadow files, or cache systems, or forensic recovery methods. And once I started rebuilding his digital footprint, it took exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes for me to reconstruct the last 8 months of his communications. What I discovered made me physically sick. Because the betrayal had started much earlier than I ever imagined, and what Daniel and Rachel were planning went far beyond an affair. The first message I recovered appeared harmless. It was dated June 14th, 2019. Rachel had sent Daniel a short text after one of their business meetings. "Good meeting today. I think the investors are finally starting to see your vision." Daniel replied 2 minutes later, "Couldn't have done it without you." At first glance, it looked like normal professional communication, but the deeper I went into the recovered files, the clearer the pattern became. The tone gradually changed. Professional messages turned into personal ones. Personal messages turned into something far more intimate. One message stopped me cold. It was sent at 11:48 p.m. "Rachel, are you still awake?" Daniel responded almost instantly. "Daniel, can't sleep." "Rachel, thinking about her?" "Daniel, always." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Rachel, soon." That word sat on the screen like a quiet promise. Soon. I kept scrolling. Lunch meetings that lasted 3 hours. Late night conversations. Photos. One photo in particular made my stomach twist. Rachel was standing in front of the mirror in a black lace dress. The background was unmistakable. It was our bedroom. The message beneath it read, "Do you like this one?" Daniel's reply came immediately. "You look incredible." My hands went cold on the keyboard, but even that wasn't the worst part. The affair was only the surface layer. Buried deeper in the recovered documents was something far more disturbing. A folder titled Preparation. Inside were several documents, legal drafts, notes, financial breakdowns. At first, I thought they were related to Daniel's real estate work, but the moment I opened the first file, I realized what I was looking at. It was a draft custody petition, prepared by a divorce attorney named Lawrence Sterling. My name appeared over and over again throughout the document. Every paragraph painted a version of me that barely resembled reality. According to the petition, I was emotionally distant, obsessed with surveillance, psychologically unstable, dangerously controlling. The document claimed my military background had left me with unresolved trauma. It suggested that my work in corporate security had turned into a dangerous obsession with monitoring people. And the most devastating accusation of all, it claimed the children were afraid of me, afraid of my unpredictable behavior, afraid of my intense need for control. The document carefully implied that my professional access to surveillance equipment made me a potential threat to my own family. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen. My pulse was pounding in my ears. Every single sentence had clearly been crafted to appeal to a family court judge. The language was deliberate, strategic, designed to make me appear unstable without making accusations that could easily be disproven. And then I saw something that made the entire situation even worse. At the bottom of the document was a note. Judge H.M. already aware of preliminary evidence. Judge H.M. Helen Morgan, Daniel's mother. A federal judge. The realization hit me like ice water. They weren't just planning a divorce. They were planning a complete destruction. Daniel and Rachel intended to destroy my professional reputation, trigger lawsuits against my company, bankrupt me, take the house, take my assets, and most importantly, take my children. All while using Daniel's powerful family connections to ensure the courts sided with them. For several minutes, I sat in complete silence. Shock slowly gave way to something else. A quiet, controlled anger. In the Army, we were trained to remain calm under extreme pressure. Panic clouds judgment. Emotion leads to mistakes, and mistakes get people killed. So I forced myself to breathe slowly. Analyze the situation. Break it down like any other intelligence problem. Fact 1. Daniel was having an affair with Rachel. Fact 2. They had been planning for months to destroy my reputation and take my children. Fact 3. They believed I had absolutely no idea what they were doing. And that last fact was their biggest mistake. Because from that moment forward, I stopped thinking like a wife. I started thinking like an intelligence officer. If Daniel and Rachel were running an operation against me, then I was going to do exactly what I had been trained to do. Observe. Document. build evidence, and wait until the perfect moment to dismantle their entire plan. I closed the laptop slowly and looked around the quiet kitchen. Upstairs, Tyler and Emma were still asleep. For a moment, the thought of what Daniel had planned for our children made my chest tighten painfully. He was willing to poison them against me, convince them their own mother was dangerous. All for money, for control, for Rachel. That was the moment something inside me changed. Not rage, not revenge. Something colder, something far more dangerous. Resolve. If Daniel wanted to play games with surveillance, then he had chosen the worst possible opponent, because he had forgotten one very important fact about me. For 12 years, my job in the Army had been counterintelligence. And now, the people I loved most had just become my targets. Once the shock faded, I did what I had been trained to do my entire adult life. I built a plan, not an emotional reaction, not a confrontation, a methodical investigation. Because if Daniel and Rachel were preparing a legal war against me, then every move I made had to be based on evidence, not anger. The first rule of intelligence work is simple. Never alert your targets that they've been discovered. So I acted exactly the same as before. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I asked Tyler about soccer practice and helped Emma clean glitter off the kitchen table after one of her art projects. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I started watching everything. Surveillance begins. Installing surveillance equipment in my own home felt surreal, but technically it wasn't illegal. The house belonged to both of us, and I had the tools. My company owned several pieces of compact monitoring equipment used during corporate investigations. Tiny cameras, smaller than a coin. Audio recorders that could operate for weeks without being detected. Within 2 days, several discrete devices were placed in strategic locations. Inside a smoke detector in the living room. Inside a picture frame near the kitchen. Beneath a shelf in Daniel's home office. I also placed an audio recorder inside Daniel's car. Then I waited. And it didn't take long. 3 days later, Daniel and Rachel were sitting in the living room while the kids were upstairs. Rachel was drinking wine. Daniel was leaning back on the couch, relaxed. The recording captured everything. Rachel: have you talked to Sterling yet? Daniel: yeah, he's finishing the petition. Rachel: and your mom? Daniel: she already reviewed the draft. She thinks it'll hold up. My stomach tightened when I heard that. Rachel's voice lowered. Rachel: do you think Julia suspects anything? Daniel laughed. Actually laughed. Daniel: please, she's completely buried in her business. Rachel: you're sure? Daniel: Rachel, she barely notices what's happening in this house. That sentence stayed with me long after the recording ended. Not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something important. Daniel had completely underestimated me. And in intelligence operations, underestimating your opponent is fatal. The hotel evidence. Over the next few weeks, the recordings continued. Rachel visited the house frequently, sometimes during the day while I was working, sometimes late at night after the kids were asleep. But the most important evidence didn't come from the house. It came from their hotel visits. Rachel and Daniel had a favorite pattern: luxury hotels downtown, the Ritz-Carlton, the Four Seasons, the Peninsula. Corporate travel habits die hard. Executives tend to repeat routines. I confirmed the pattern through hotel reservation logs and surveillance cameras in public areas. Within a month, I had high-definition footage of them entering hotel rooms together on multiple occasions. Legally admissible evidence. But what they said inside those rooms mattered even more. One recording from the Ritz-Carlton still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. Room 2847. Rachel's voice was playful. Rachel: you think she'll actually fight it? Daniel sighed. Daniel: Julia? No. Rachel: you're that confident? Daniel: she's too rational. She'll settle once she realizes how strong our case is. Rachel laughed softly. Then Daniel said something that made my hands curl into fists. Daniel: and honestly, the kids barely notice when she's gone anymore. Rachel chuckled. Rachel: we'll make sure they understand why. Daniel: exactly. They deserve to know the truth. The truth. That word echoed in my mind for days. Because what they were planning wasn't just legal manipulation. They were planning to rewrite my children's perception of their own mother. And that was something I would never allow. The financial discovery. But the most valuable intelligence didn't come from the recordings. It came from Rachel's phone. Criminals often make the same mistake. They focus entirely on their target's vulnerabilities and ignore their own. Rachel's phone security was laughably weak. Her password was her birthday, February 14th, Valentine's Day. Once I accessed the device, the scale of the situation became much larger than I expected. Rachel wasn't just planning a divorce strategy. She was planning financial theft. Several encrypted banking apps revealed a series of offshore accounts, 2 in the Cayman Islands, 1 in Switzerland. Over the previous 6 months, Rachel had quietly transferred money from multiple sources, some from Daniel's real estate deals, some from our joint investment accounts. Even worse, there was evidence that Daniel had taken out a loan using our house as collateral, without telling me. The total amount transferred offshore so far, $340,000. But the final discovery made the entire situation crystal clear. Rachel had booked a one-way, first-class ticket to Monaco. Departure date, March 15th, exactly 2 weeks after Daniel planned to file for divorce. The strategy suddenly made perfect sense. Step 1, destroy me in court. Step 2, take half my assets. Step 3, disappear with the money. And Rachel was planning to disappear without Daniel. She was going to betray him just as completely as they had betrayed me. The hidden Morgan secret. While reviewing Daniel's documents, I also found something else. A reference buried inside one of Rachel's legal notes. It mentioned a sealed court case from 2011 involving the Morgan family. Just a short line. No details, but it immediately caught my attention because powerful families rarely seal court cases unless they have something to hide. What started as curiosity quickly turned into a 3-week investigation. Court records, financial contributions, witness statements that had mysteriously changed. By the time I finished, I had uncovered something far darker than I expected. The sealed case involved Daniel's younger brother, Brandon Morgan. And 12 years earlier, Brandon had caused a drunk driving accident that killed an entire family. 4 people. A mother, a father, 2 little girls. The victims were Maria Martinez, 34, a nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital. Her husband, Carlos Martinez, 36, a construction worker. Their daughters, Isabella, 8 years old, Sophia, 5 years old. They were driving home from Sophia's birthday party. Brandon Morgan was driving his father's Mercedes, drunk, going 70 miles per hour in a 35 zone. He ran a red light. The crash killed all 4 of them instantly. Brandon walked away with only a bruised rib, and somehow he never went to prison. The deeper I investigated, the clearer the corruption became. Evidence had disappeared. Witnesses had changed their statements. The prosecutor accepted a shockingly lenient plea deal. Instead of prison for vehicular manslaughter, Brandon spent 6 months in a private rehabilitation center. Meanwhile, Senator David Morgan made $150,000 in campaign donations to the district attorney responsible for the case. The Martinez family had spent 12 years trying to reopen the investigation. Every lawyer told them the same thing. The Morgan family had too much political power. No one would touch the case. But by the end of my investigation, I had something no one else had ever assembled. A complete timeline, financial records, witness statements, proof of corruption, ironclad evidence. And suddenly, Daniel and Rachel weren't the only ones with something to lose. Because now, I had the power to destroy the entire Morgan family. But instead of acting immediately, I made a different decision. I would let Daniel and Rachel make the first move. I wanted them to commit fully to their plan, to believe they were winning, and then I would end it. For weeks after uncovering everything, I lived a strange double life. On the outside, nothing had changed. I still woke up early to make breakfast for Tyler and Emma. I still drove them to school when I could. I still kissed Daniel goodbye before work. I smiled. I nodded. I played the role of the unaware wife perfectly, but inside something heavy had settled in my chest. A quiet grief, because every time Daniel looked at me across the dinner table, I now knew exactly what he had been planning behind my back. And the worst part wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the money. It was the children. The recordings replayed in my mind constantly. The kids barely notice when she's gone anymore. We'll make sure they understand the truth. The truth. That word had been twisted into something ugly. They were planning to turn my own children against me, to convince them their mother was unstable, dangerous, someone they should fear. The thought made my stomach twist with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. One evening in late February, I was helping Emma with a school art project at the kitchen table. Glitter had somehow ended up everywhere. Her hands were covered in purple paint. She looked up at me suddenly. "Mom?" "Yeah, sweetheart?" She hesitated. "Are you going to live somewhere else?" The question froze me in place. "What do you mean?" Emma shrugged nervously. "Rachel said sometimes moms move away when they work too much." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Rachel had been planting seeds, even with the kids. I forced myself to smile gently. "No, honey," I said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Emma seemed relieved, but inside, I felt something crack. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off. The house was quiet, too quiet. I replayed every moment of the past 8 years in my mind. The fundraiser where I met Daniel, our wedding, the day Tyler and Emma were born, all the vacations, all the nights I stayed up working while believing I was building a better future for our family. Had any of it been real? Or had Daniel been slowly turning against me for years? The thought that my marriage might have been built on something false felt almost unbearable. For the first time since discovering the truth, I felt something dangerously close to doubt. Maybe I should just walk away. Maybe I should take the kids and disappear. Start somewhere new. Avoid the war that was clearly coming. But then another thought followed immediately. If I ran, Daniel and Rachel would win. They would control the story. They would tell the courts whatever they wanted. And Tyler and Emma would grow up believing lies about their own mother. That possibility was unacceptable. I wasn't just fighting for my reputation anymore. I was fighting for my children's understanding of who I was. Still, there were moments when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I walked quietly into the kids' room. Tyler and Emma were asleep in their twin beds. Tyler had kicked his blanket halfway onto the floor. Emma was clutching one of the stuffed animals Rachel had bought her months earlier. Seeing that toy made my chest tighten painfully. Rachel had been smiling at them, reading them bedtime stories, all while planning to take them away from me. I gently pulled Tyler's blanket back over his shoulders. Emma shifted slightly in her sleep, but didn't wake. For several minutes, I just stood there, watching them breathe. Small, peaceful, completely unaware of the war happening around them. That moment reminded me why I couldn't give up, why I couldn't lose control. I leaned down and whispered quietly, even though they couldn't hear me, "I'm going to protect you." Then I walked back into the hallway and closed the door softly. Standing there in the dim light, something inside me finally hardened. The sadness faded. The doubt disappeared. What replaced it was something much steadier. Focus. Daniel and Rachel believed they were the ones controlling the situation. They thought they were manipulating events from behind the scenes. They thought they had the stronger legal position, the political connections, the advantage. What they didn't understand was that the game had already changed. Because by that point, I had more evidence than they could possibly imagine. Proof of their affair. Proof of their financial crimes. Proof of the corruption that had protected Daniel's brother for 12 years. The only thing left now was choosing when to reveal it. And the moment that opportunity arrived came sooner than I expected. Early March, a phone call from Daniel's divorce lawyer. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early March. I was in my office reviewing a security audit report when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Chicago area code. I answered calmly. "Julia Mitchell speaking." The man on the other end sounded polished and confident, the kind of voice that had spent years inside expensive courtrooms. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Lawrence Sterling. I represent your husband, Daniel Morgan." There it was. The move I had been waiting for. I leaned back in my chair. What can I do for you, Mr. Sterling? I believe it would be in everyone's best interest if we met to discuss your husband's petition before this matter becomes unnecessarily public. His tone carried a hint of arrogance, as if the outcome had already been decided. I almost smiled. Of course, I said calmly. When would you like to meet? Today, 2 o'clock. The lawyer's office. Sterling's office was on the 47th floor of Willis Tower. Mahogany furniture, leather-bound law books lining the walls, framed certificates highlighting decades of aggressive family law victories. This was clearly a man who made a very comfortable living destroying marriages in court. When I entered the conference room, Daniel was already sitting beside Sterling. Rachel wasn't there, but her presence felt like a shadow hovering behind everything. Daniel avoided eye contact. Sterling gestured toward the chair across from him. Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming. He slid a thick folder across the polished conference table. These are your husband's proposed terms. I opened the folder slowly. The demands were exactly what I expected. Full custody of Tyler and Emma awarded to Daniel. I would receive supervised visitation 1 weekend per month. Daniel would keep the house. Both BMWs and 60% of my company's assets. That alone amounted to roughly $1.4 million. There was also a request for $8,000 per month in alimony for 15 years. If I accepted those terms, I would lose almost everything. My business, my home, my children. Sterling leaned back in his chair, watching my reaction carefully. Ms. Mitchell, he said smoothly, your husband has substantial evidence regarding certain troubling aspects of your behavior. I closed the folder and looked up at him. Troubling? Yes. He clasped his hands together. Your surveillance equipment, your history in military intelligence, your excessive work schedule. He paused for dramatic effect, all of which may suggest a pattern of psychological instability. I didn't say anything. Sterling continued. The petition also raises concerns about the emotional safety of the children in your presence. Daniel still refused to look at me. Sterling added one final detail. Judge Helen Morgan has already reviewed preliminary documentation and indicated she would view this matter very seriously. Helen Morgan, Daniel's mother. The federal judge. The implication was clear. They believed they had already won. Sterling folded his hands calmly. If you sign the agreement today, we can avoid a lengthy and very public court battle. I let the silence stretch for several seconds. Then I slowly reached down and opened my briefcase. Inside was a manila envelope. I placed it carefully on the table. Please give this to your client, I said. Sterling frowned. What is this? Information. Daniel finally looked up. I met his eyes for the first time since the meeting began. Read it very carefully before you decide how aggressive you want to be. Sterling opened the envelope. The first photograph slid out. A high-resolution image. Daniel and Rachel entering the Ritz-Carlton together. The second photo showed them kissing in the hotel lobby. Sterling's expression shifted slightly. Then he pulled out printed text messages, bank statements, wire transfer records, evidence of the $340,000 transferred into offshore accounts. Daniel's face had gone pale, but I wasn't finished. Sterling reached the final section of documents, the investigation file, the one involving the 2011 Morgan family accident, photos of the crash site. Witness statements, financial records showing campaign donations to the district attorney, evidence that had been buried for 12 years. Sterling stopped reading. The room had become very quiet. I closed my briefcase. You might want to start looking for a new client, I said calmly. Sterling stared at me. What exactly are you threatening, Ms. Mitchell? I stood up. Nothing. Then I looked directly at Daniel. I'm offering you a choice. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the conference room. The elevator doors closed slowly, and for the first time since the entire nightmare had begun, I finally felt the balance of power shift. Because Daniel and Rachel had spent months believing they were controlling the game, but now they understood something very important. They weren't the hunters. They were the ones being watched. And the next phone call came exactly 6 hours later. The first phone call came 6 hours later. I was still in my office when my phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed Daniel. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I answered. Hello? His voice was shaking with a mixture of rage and panic. "Julia, we need to talk. Right now." I leaned back in my chair. Everything I needed to say was already inside that envelope. "You don't understand what you're doing," he snapped. "My family has connections throughout this entire city." I almost laughed. "Your family also has secrets, Daniel." The line went silent. I continued calmly. "Dark ones. The kind that don't survive public investigation." He lowered his voice. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I paused deliberately. "Why don't you ask your mother about Maria Martinez?" The silence on the other end became heavy. "Or Carlos Martinez," I added. "Or their daughters, Isabella and Sophia." Nearly 30 seconds passed before Daniel finally spoke again. His voice had changed. "What do you want?" There it was. The question I had been waiting for. "I want justice," I said calmly. "Withdraw the divorce petition." "You can't be serious." "Return every dollar that Rachel moved offshore." He didn't respond. "And one more thing," I continued. "Your mother resigns from the federal bench." Daniel's voice rose again. "You're asking my entire family to destroy themselves." "No," I said quietly. "You did that yourselves 12 years ago." I hung up before he could answer. Rachel's call. The next call came about an hour later. Rachel Parker. Her tone was completely different from Daniel's. Daniel had been frightened. Rachel was furious. "You've been spying on us," she snapped. "You sick woman." I remained calm. "You mean gathering evidence?" "You hacked my phone." "You should have chosen a better password." The silence on the line lasted only a second before she continued. "You're not going to get away with this." "Actually," I said evenly, "I already have." Rachel's voice sharpened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Then I delivered the line that stopped her cold. 3 offshore accounts, Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Total transfers, $340,000. Silence. "Also," I added casually, "your one-way ticket to Monaco on March 15th. Another pause. "You were planning to let Daniel destroy me in court," I continued, "then disappear with the money." Her breathing had become noticeably uneven. "You can't prove any of that." "I can prove all of it. Bank records, wire transfers, flight confirmations, everything." I leaned forward slightly as I spoke. "The only question now is whether you want to face criminal charges here in Chicago or spend the rest of your life running from federal investigators." Rachel didn't respond. A second later, the line went dead. The call I was waiting for. The third call came later that evening. The name on the screen read, Helen Morgan, federal judge, Daniel's mother. Her voice, normally powerful and commanding, sounded fragile. "What exactly do you want, Julia?" I kept my tone respectful. "I already told Daniel." "You're asking me to destroy my career." "With respect, Judge Morgan," I said quietly, "that happened 12 years ago." She inhaled slowly. "You don't understand how complicated that situation was." "I understand perfectly. 4 innocent people. A drunk driver. A political cover-up. I have enough evidence to reopen the Martinez case," I continued, "and enough financial records to show exactly how that case was buried." The silence lasted a long time. Finally, she whispered, "If we agree to your terms, this information never leaves your possession?" "Yes." "And if we refuse?" "Then the Martinez family finally receives the justice they've been waiting for." I ended the call without another word. Rachel's mistake. What I hadn't anticipated was how desperate Rachel would become once she realized she had no way out. The next morning at 6:47 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel, but he wasn't angry. He was crying. "Julia, Rachel's gone." "What do you mean?" "She emptied every account. All of them. The investment accounts, the development funds, everything." I immediately checked the surveillance logs. Rachel's car had left her apartment garage late the previous night. Her phone had been turned off shortly after. A quick call to one of my airline contacts confirmed my suspicion. Rachel Parker had boarded an emergency flight to Paris. Depart 11:30 p.m. She had and run, leaving Daniel to face the consequences alone. Federal consequences. I made one final phone call to an old contact from my Army days, Special Agent Tom Murphy, FBI, Financial Crimes Division. "Tom," I said, I have a situation you might be interested in." Within hours, the process began. Rachel's offshore accounts were flagged. Financial transfers were traced. Arrest warrants were prepared. 6 hours later, her assets were frozen by federal court order. 12 hours later, her name appeared on Interpol's international watch list. 18 hours later, Rachel Parker was arrested at Charles de Gaulle Airport while attempting to board a connecting flight to Switzerland, the country she thought had no extradition agreement with the United States. 2 weeks later, the final meeting took place in Lawrence Sterling's office. But this time, the balance of power had completely changed. Daniel sat across from me looking like a completely different person. The confident man I once married was gone. In his place sat someone who understood exactly how badly he had miscalculated, and the documents waiting on the table in front of him would end everything. 2 weeks later, we met again in Lawrence Sterling's office. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The same mahogany desk, the same leather chairs, the same skyline of Chicago stretching behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. Yet the balance of power had shifted entirely. Daniel sat across from me at the conference table. For a moment, I barely recognized him. His expensive suit looked wrinkled. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. The confident man who once believed he controlled every move in this situation had disappeared. Sterling slid the documents across the table. "Mr. Morgan has agreed to the terms." Daniel didn't argue, didn't negotiate. He simply stared at the papers in front of him. The agreement was simple. Full custody of Tyler and Emma would remain with me. Daniel would withdraw the divorce accusations and publicly acknowledge that the allegations against me had been false. Financial assets would be divided fairly. No manipulation. No legal warfare. Just the quiet ending of something that had already been broken. For a long moment, Daniel didn't move. Then, slowly, he picked up the pen. His hands were shaking. "Julia," he said quietly. I didn't respond. "There was a time when we were happy." I looked at him calmly. "Yes. Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" The question lingered in the air. For a moment, memories flashed through my mind. The fundraiser where we met. Our wedding. The day our children were born. But those memories belonged to a version of our life that no longer existed. "You can't save something that was built on lies," I said softly. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he signed. The pen scratched across the paper. And just like that, 8 years of marriage officially ended. The aftermath. The consequences came quickly. Judge Helen Morgan resigned from the federal bench 3 days later, citing personal health concerns. But inside Chicago's legal community, everyone knew the real reason. The Martinez case was reopened with the new evidence I had provided. Daniel's brother, Brandon Morgan, was arrested and charged with vehicular manslaughter and obstruction of justice. For the first time in 12 years, the Martinez family finally had a chance to see justice served. Rachel Parker was extradited back to the United States 2 months later. Facing charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering, she accepted a plea deal that sent her to federal prison. Daniel lost nearly everything: his reputation, his connections, his career in real estate. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Word spread through Chicago's corporate community about how I handled the situation. Clients began reaching out specifically because they trusted someone who understood how betrayal worked. Mitchell Security Consulting grew faster than ever. We expanded to 28 employees. Annual revenue eventually passed $4.2 million. But none of that mattered as much as the quiet evenings at home. Saturday mornings making chocolate chip pancakes. Helping Tyler with baseball practice. Listening to Emma explain the stories behind her endless art projects. 6 months after the divorce, I sat in our backyard on a warm summer evening. Tyler and Emma were running through the sprinkler, laughing so hard they could barely stand. Watching them, I realized something important. Daniel had once accused me of choosing work over my family. And maybe, in some ways, he had been right, but not anymore. Every decision I make now starts with a single question. What's best for my children? People sometimes ask if I regret how everything ended, if I wish I had fought harder to save the marriage. The answer is simple. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth is something powerful. It doesn't need anger. It doesn't need manipulation. It simply waits for the right moment. And then it reveals everything. Sometimes the people who think they're the smartest in the room are the ones who destroy themselves. And sometimes, when you stay patient, when you protect what truly matters, the truth wins in the end.